Good morning, Jeff.
Morning.
Let's get started because we got a treat for everybody today.
Oh, yeah. Let's do this.
To the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
And Lisa's back for the number one spot again. Good morning,
Good
Lisa.
morning.
So happy to see you here this morning. Jeff, after last Thursday, we had an amazing episode with Marcus. We've kind of had that theme of having like a personal development every Thursday.
Yeah.
Today is something that I truly believe we're going to give so much value to hear a
I believe
story.
so too.
Today we actually have award-winning author Don Gillmor. He's award-winning Canadian novelist, journalist, and children's book author. The reason why we're bringing him on today is that he's actually just recently launched a book, Carload Ritchie, about probably the greatest salesman that we don't know about. So honestly, we want to bring in our good friend here, Don, to the show this morning to Sales Shatter. Good morning, John. Don, how you doing?
Morning.
Good. How are you?
Great.
Doing.
Great.
It could be better in Toronto, but it's one of those days. So I do want to get into it. As you are an award-winning novelist, tell us a little bit more. You definitely did launch a book just now with Carload Ritchie. We were discussing about it a little bit. What made you want to get into that story?
Well, what happened was I met Carload Ritchie's grandson is a guy named Biff Matthews who owns an investment company in Toronto, and we have a mutual friend. And I was talking to Biff, and Biff started telling me about his grandfather, and Biff had grown up in Carload Ritchie had this massive estate north of Toronto. It was like one of these 30-room mansions on Lake Simcoe. And Biff had spent his summers there, so he's sort of steeped in this idea of this grandfather who died, before Biff was born. And the more he started telling me about this guy, the more interested I became, because he mentioned that when he died, Time magazine said, that he was the world's greatest salesman, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like,
Yeah.
how did that happen, and why do we not know anything about this guy?
Awesome, man. Like I was telling you, Don, that even for me doing my own research, I tried to Google him, I tried to YouTube him, just use all kind of channels to find out. And he is one of the world's greatest salesmen, but there's not too much media or
Yeah.
any kind of pieces that we can look for him. Can you tell us who Carload Ritchie was?
Well, one of the reasons there's nothing on him, I think he only gave 3 or 4 interviews in his life. He was sort of media shy, even for the day. And he grew up in a small town about 5 hours north of Toronto. And this was, he was born in the 19th century, so this would be, hard to get to. And he was never part of the Toronto establishment. There was a kind of staid Methodist Toronto business establishment that he was never part of. So he always was sort of on the outside. But oddly, he was a kind of globalist ahead of his time. Like when he started selling across the country and he realized there was all kinds of parts of Canada that were underserviced by salespeople, basically. And then he sort of, expanded that idea and realized that there's, all these countries in South America, Africa, Australia, that were also underserviced. And he ended up creating this kind of global sales force, which was, extraordinary for the time.
Wow. You figure a gentleman like that, who didn't want to do anything with the media or talk to somebody. It sounds like he's an introvert, but quite the opposite for being so successful.
Yeah, and he was in the Time magazine obit describes him as short and plump with a squeaky voice. So he's not kind of like he doesn't have the natural attributes of what you would think the world's greatest salesman would have.
Right.
But it was clearly his passion and his life, because they mentioned that he would travel up to 200,000 miles, I think, in a year. And this was back when he was still going by ship over to Europe. I think Pan Am had the first transatlantic flights in about 1927 or so, and he started flying once you could. But he was on the road all the time, And he made a point of going anywhere that he was selling to, he would go to himself and meet these people. So he wanted to see the country, he wanted to see what the people were like. And I think that was a big part of success, because that was rare, I think, back then.
And I think like one of the things that we kind of mentioned too that I was reading on is that he grew some of the biggest companies bigger than Canadian banks itself, right? So he was extremely successful in that manner. Jeff, as Don just mentioned, he started with meeting face to face. That's so important for us in our sales industry to get in front of our customers and have those conversations, to put a face to the name and not be a person behind a LinkedIn profile or just behind
Right.
or her phone call or anything like that. Don, what were some of the companies that Harold owned or founded?
Well, one of the probably the turning point in his life was he was in his mid-20s, and he took the ship over to London, England, and he went to the JC Eno company. They manufactured Eno's fruit salts, which are still
God.
around, but it was a huge company back then. And he went to them and said, "Listen, I can double your sales in Canada, and if I don't, you don't have to pay me any commission." And so they said, "Well, we'll give it a shot. Why not?" And he ended up quadrupling their sales. And so he he ended up expanding their footprint in the world, and selling them in South America and places they'd never been before. Because at that time, this is like early part of the 20th century, there was a kind of arrogance in Britain, which they felt like British products were the best in the world, they assumed, and if someone wanted them, they could come and find them. They weren't that interested in finding new territories. And so he ended up, was sort of this launching point, because he suddenly was making a lot of money with and like Warren Buffett, he ended up buying in 1928, I guess. Like he realized the companies that were doing well, he thought, why just sell them? Why not, own them? So he ended up buying JC which was a huge deal back then, because I think it was, I think he paid 10 million for it in the 20s. It would have been 150 million roughly in today's currency. So that I think was the turning point.
For him, and you just actually gave me some childhood flashbacks, because as a kid I remember like my mom would always have Enos around, like upset stomach, anything like that, you put it in and then you see like it was like kind of like the Alka-Seltzer and things like that. Like you said, that was the turning point for him. What do we know about his background, like afterwards? Like did he do any kind of like training? Like how did he keep his legacy kind of going?
One of the things he did, he would bring in his sales representatives from all around the world. So, it'd be, I think, 140 guys or something. And all of them, would be men. And he would fly them into Toronto, and they would stay at the grandest hotel, which at that time was the King Edward Hotel on King Street. And he would give a 1-week seminar, and it would be kind of product based, because he was selling, one of the things he did, and one of the things that helped him during the Depression, for example, was he always had a sort of line of staples. He was selling groceries and, dried beans and, so there was always this sort of a steady flow of income, regardless of what was happening in the world. And he would tell people, how he had sold, this and that, and get all these guys on board, basically.
How did he contact these people, and how did he know that they were good salesmen? He did all these seminars when he finally got them all together, but how did he identify them as being a good salesman that he wanted them to work for him?
Well, it's a good question, because he was one of these guys who he had no vices. I mean, he didn't drink or smoke or and he wasn't really he wasn't a regular churchgoer, but he was a kind of real grounded sort of moral guy. And he always said he wanted men of good character, which is how he described it. But he also said he didn't want what he called one knock men, which was guys who would just show up, and if they got turned down, that's the end of it. They don't try again. So he was looking for guys who were kind of upstanding, but had some kind of persistence. And I think he was looking at the long term. So he wasn't trying to like unload stuff on people that they would regret. He was really trying to develop customers that would be there a decade later. And so I think that was also part of his success. And what he did was send out, like, he had a handful of guys in Toronto that were his sort of key guys, and they would go out and kind of look for the guys that they knew Harold Ritchie would want, basically, in New Zealand or Ecuador or wherever they were.
So he had a process, maybe a written process, that he chose the elite who wanted to represent him for what he was. And then they went out and canvassed and found them, and then pretty much emulated and mirrored what Carload Ritchie did.
Yeah, exactly. I think the whole sales force was essentially in his own image, and he wasn't looking for, when he was a kid on Manitoulin Island, it was a very remote place. There was no bridge to it, so you could only get there by ferry. But his dad owned a general store, and so these salesmen would come, like twice a year probably, and to sell stuff to his father. And I think that idea of the romance of the traveling salesman, because you're on this little it's a big island, but still you're in the middle of nowhere, and you're a 10-year-old kid, and these guys come in and they've got stories from New York or wherever, and you're that's your entertainment when you're 10. Like, there's nothing else for you. So I think he had this romantic sense of the salesman, and I think he kind of kept that sense of romance, but it was always very grounded.
Did he have like what we have now, right? When you work for a company or a brokerage, they have sales quotas that need to be met at the end of each month. Did he have such a thing in place? I mean, how did he measure the accomplishments of each one of his salesmen in order to grow his business?
I don't know. I think at that time, there wasn't the same kind of pressure in terms of like kind of quarterly results, or, that he was looking at, kind of like a 5-year plan. Because I know in the beginning of the Depression, when things were sort of sinking, he was aware that, we're going to lose business here and there, but we'll be able to make up a bit over here. And so I don't think he had there wasn't the same kind of pressures short term for him. And I think that was just like a function of society back then. They didn't have, right now everything is short term basically. And so I think he really took a longer term, and I don't think these guys were under pressure to produce in 6 months or something. He was, I think he'd look at their record after like 2 years, and if it wasn't working, maybe the guy's gotta go. But he'd give them time.
Yeah, I would think during that time in the Depression that there was a huge driving force on that individual, because look, it was the Depression, right? It was feast or famine. So if they didn't provide or create sales, they couldn't feed their families, I would think, right? Logically on that. So I think it was more self-driven than anything else that helped him to succeed with his business. I would think anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And, the other thing that he did, he recognized, what the world wanted at different times. And he realized, patent medicines, which were huge in the 19th century. And these are all these like Beecham's pills and, Dodd's little liver pills. And there was hundreds of these. Yeah. And some of them had incredible claims. Like, they would claim to cure cholera and cancer. And there was one, what was it called? Ebenezer Silby's solar tincture, and it claimed to cure sudden death. Like, if you give it to a guy and come back to life,
I wonder how those sales went.
Yeah. And so, there was all this stuff out there, and a lot of it did work, because back then you could have cannabis, opium, morphine, all cocaine. 7-Up had lithium in it up until the 40s. So you actually had all the drugs in these things that would make people feel better, at least temporarily. But he
Right.
recognized, this was a product that was cheap to manufacture, and it really relied on marketing more than any other thing. And he took the best of them. He didn't deal in the really wacky ones, but he took things like Beecham's pills, and I mean, Eno was part of that. But what happened was he realized this. This is where he has to start buying these companies, because not only is this stuff cheap to manufacture, but you could set up a factory anywhere, because the factories aren't that complicated. You're not making Teslas. You're just making these little pills out of, soap and ginger and, whatever. And so I think that, that was sort of the third act of his life, was because when he died, Time magazine said, he was on the cusp of a much vaster enterprise. And I think what happened was all those patent medicines, they ended up becoming big pharma, like Beecham. Glaxo was a milk additive in the 19th century, and it became GlaxoSmithKline. But he owned or sold, Beecham, Glasgow, like all those companies that ended up becoming big pharma. He either owned or sold, and he recognized where the world was going. And I think that was a really big part of his success, was getting a sense of, where we're moving as a global society, and what it is we need or want.
So his niche and the vertical in which he worked in was pharma. That was his niche. Did he ever try to buy companies that he thought would work but didn't, and failed miserably?
Yeah, he did. He had some. The first disaster was he bought a chocolate company in Britain, and I think this was in the either right after or right before the second or the First World War, and then something happened where he couldn't, I guess he couldn't get the raw materials or something, or Cadbury was, doing much better, and kind of, ate his lunch essentially, and he realized he didn't know anything about this business, and there was people that were already entrenched who knew a lot about it, and he just kind of, so he sold it at a loss and got out of it. And then there was a couple of other failures, but he said, you just learn from these and you move on. And usually, he said, it was a case of just not understanding the product or the market. So you can see that he kind of winnowed his world. He always had groceries as this sort of, steady income bottom line. And then pharma was where, he was experimenting with, and where the big money was, some failures as well, but when they worked, boy, they really worked.
So he learned from his mistakes, and he kept grounded, and he just drove down that lane and became very, very successful by doing that. But without those failures, do you think that he would have succeeded?
No, and I think and who knows where that kind of drive and confidence comes from, especially, from a kid, who grew up in the middle of nowhere, from, in a modest household. But you can see that, when he went over to London to pitch JC Eno to sell their product in Canada, the first time he went over, I think he was 24 years old, they turned him down. They said, we don't care, even if you're going to promise to double the market, we're not going to give you our line. And but he came back the following year and pitched them again, and they finally just said, I think, to get rid of him, like, okay, go ahead, take a shot at it. And then that worked out for both of them. But he did have this, and that, back then, if you're a 24-year-old guy of relatively modest means, to take the Queen Mary or whatever over to London, like, that's a pretty big, you're taking a real leap of faith. And
I was just about to say that. Yeah. I mean, you think about back then the cost just to take the Queen Mary over there. I mean, the First World War was what, 1917, right? So hard times, oh yeah, finding that money to take that leap of faith to get on, Queen Mary and go ahead and push what you believe in, that's beyond a leap of faith. I mean, especially back then, he must have had, that vision and that drive, that there was no room in his head for failure, and he just kept on that path, and lo and behold, look what happened to him, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And so I think taking those shots early in life,
Hmm.
I think he did have these failures, but I think the fact that he had some success was enough to kind of propel him through. And then I think there was failures kind of all along the line, but at that point you're much better equipped to deal with them because you've seen the far side of failure. You go in there and it looks devastating, but you get through it and then you get onto something else. So I think it became, he got much more philosophical about it, and I mean, he died at 52. So,
Wow.
he was a young guy.
Okay. Don, I want to get to more about you in terms of like your process of this. Like you said, you spoke with his grandson, Biff. What were like the moving parts and what was like important for you to kind of start at basically ground zero and basically put this whole book together?
Well, the first thing I wanted to do was I wanted to see where this guy grew up, So I it's about Manitoulin Island is about a 5-hour drive from Toronto. So I went up there and stayed in Little Current, which is the town that he grew up in, and they had a newspaper back then, and so you could go into the local library and go into the microfiche and look at the newspaper, and just to get a sense of, you read a newspaper from 1897 and you get a sense of the town because the newspapers were so parochial back then. They'd have Mr. Jones fell off his ladder while cleaning the eaves troughs last night. That would be like the headline, and so you really got a sense of this world that he grew up in. So I went there, and then on the way back on Lake Simcoe, which is about an hour and a half north of Toronto, his summer house is still there, this 30-room mansion, and the guy that owns it now, lovely guy, and I told him what I was up to, and I said, can I take a look at the house? So he gave me a tour of this house. It's like extraordinary, 17 bedrooms and 10-car garage. It was actually would have been a stable when he had it built, but on 70 acres right on the lake. And so you get this sense of the kind of grand scale that, from Manitoulin, where you're in this little, house, and then this is your summer house. That trajectory was, I found really interesting. So I really wanted to kind of see those places physically and get a sense of this guy.
That's honestly amazing. And from start to finish, what was like your timeline, your whole process from getting this book published?
It's about a year, I guess, so it took the other problem, as you said, there's so little on this guy.
Mhm.
And so just finding out more information about him and finding the interviews, tracing those companies, the kind of corporate history of some of these companies. So that took longer than I, would have anticipated. But yeah, I about a year.
But here, that's awesome to kind of see. What made you kind of, because when I was doing my research on yourself, you're definitely into like children's novels. You've written a ton of them. When did that? Was it a situation where you started with children's novels and then you went into the nonfiction side, or were you always kind of like a mix? Because like we said, like I've said, like you are a journalist. You've won many awards, so it's not that you've just been writing books. You've been basically all around in the media.
Yeah, well, the kids' books were sort of an odd sideline because I was primarily a journalist at the time. I wrote the first one, and I was working on this really complicated story, and I had my office at home was just filled with papers all over the place. And I started to think about how when I was a kid, I used to share a bedroom with my brother, and I was the clean guy, and he was the messy guy. You see this sort of divide down the middle of the room, and so I sat there and I wrote this book about the messiest boy in the world based on my brother. And I wrote it in like 2 hours. Like it was a picture book. So there's, there are like 35 pages. It's not a big book. And at the time, my girlfriend worked in publishing, and I gave her the manuscript, and she gave it to a publisher, and the publisher phoned like 3 days later and said, "Oh, we like your book. Well, we're going to publish it." I thought, wow, that's easy. Like you write a book in a couple hours, you can publish 3 days later. That never happened again. But I got sort of the bug where I thought, oh, these are kind of fun to write once in a while. So they became this kind of sideline, which was, and especially once I had kids, then I could, read them the stories and stuff.
So your brother, in essence, started your career.
Yeah, 3 of my children's books were based on him. So he was rich material. Yeah.
I hope he's getting those royalties after, he's getting.
Yeah, he hasn't hit him up for that yet.
Yeah.
In terms of like with Carload Ritchie, because like I said, it's a very rich story. I had a peek through of it, and I thought it was very fascinated. Is there like I know we talked about this, but what is kind of like his legacy like now? Like, is there something that we can look to? Let's say a company that's still owned by like maybe his family, or something that he started. I know you kind of said some of the things about like the big pharma things that he started, but is there like companies or anything that we can be like, oh my god, like Carload Ritchie like started this?
Well, I mean, GlaxoSmithKline claims on one of their corporate kind of histories, it traces it right back to Harold Ritchie's company, and it was this sort of like the founding ancestor of this company. And Beecham was another one. Beecham was, he didn't start it, but he sold it, and then Beecham ended up buying Ritchie's company after his death, because when he died at 52. And I think
Right.
it's, his was one of those companies where, without him, the company it wasn't going to fail, but it wouldn't have the same driving energy. Like he really was the company. It's sort of, these one-man shows. I don't know if Warren Buffett's an example, but, you have these people who, when they go, some piece of the company goes with them. And so, his companies, and I think there was about 4 or 5 of them that were actually, with his name in them. They all got bought by Beecham or some of the pharma companies, and then they kind of vanished. And they, in trying to trace them, you'd see them pop up. Like there was a lawsuit in California in like 1959 between, because Harold Ritchie owned Brill Cream at one point. That was the other thing. He got into beauty products, and he owned Brill Cream, and there was some competitor that was using a similar ad. I don't know if you remember. I'm old enough to remember the Little Dab will do you Brill Cream commercial.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so you'd see this like Harold F. Ritchie company suing someone in a California court in 59, but then any trace of his companies with his name in it vanished by like 62 or so. And so there's no corporate legacy unless you dig. And the real legacy is probably that 30-room mansion on Lake Simcoe. That's like the last kind of standing symbol of Harold Ritchie.
That's awesome, man. Don, even by doing a book like having your book Carload Ritchie, that's gonna increase his legacy as well, right? So like people like myself and people watching things like that, where can anyone purchase Carload Ritchie?
You can get it through Amazon, like right now through Amazon, and it'll be in bookstores probably in the next 2 weeks.
Nice.
That's awesome. So want to thank you so much. Yeah, honestly, it is honestly amazing, because it's something that I'm going to take value, because I know Jeff and I are going to talk a little bit more offline, like just thinking the principles that he has is exactly like I'm smiling as you're talking about the things that he's done, like going to meet customers and having niches and things like that. It's so relevant to what we do today in sales. So Don, I want to thank you so much for coming out this morning.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that joining us.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
thanks for having me, guys.
It's awesome. So I want to thank everybody for watching. We will be on replay again at 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. Eastern time on our social channels, YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Please like, comment, subscribe. If you found value in this, I found tons of value in this video today. Please share this with somebody and keep this going. Thank you to our corporate sponsor, Daman at Centurion Trucking. Jeff, Don, thank you guys again. Have yourselves a wonderful day.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Centurion Trucking, our motto is people before profit. Today's market requires more transparency, consistency, and focus on what our clients need to win. Centurion Trucking and American Logistics are poised to help their clients achieve and surpass their targets. If you're looking for a team that honors your needs, dreams, and aspirations, then get a hold of Daman at American Logistics or Centurion Trucking and start designing your career today.